I trusted my son with my retirement, and by the end of that dinner, he had quietly handed control of my life to his wife. Margaret Whitmore had worked for 42 years in the public school system of Dayton, Ohio, and when she finally retired at 70, she believed the hardest parts of life were already behind her. She had spent decades waking up before sunrise, grading papers at her kitchen table, saving every extra dollar she could. Her husband had passed away years earlier, leaving her to raise their son Daniel on her own, and she had promised herself that one day she would slow down, sit on her small back porch with a cup of coffee, and enjoy the quiet life she had earned. The retirement dinner Daniel arranged seemed thoughtful at first. It was held at a modest steakhouse not far from Margaret's home, the kind of place where families gathered to celebrate birthdays and graduations. Daniel sat across from her, smiling with the same boyish expression he had when he was younger, while his wife Lauren sat beside him, calm and attentive. Margaret felt proud watching them. She remembered the nights she stayed up late helping Daniel study for college exams. The weekends she worked extra shifts during summer programs so he would never feel the weight of financial stress. Everything she had done had been for him. The waiter placed the menus on the table, and Daniel raised a glass of iced tea to toast his mother's retirement. For a moment, the evening felt exactly the way Margaret had imagined it would. Then Daniel cleared his throat and said something that made the air around the table change. He explained that now that Margaret was retired, things might become complicated financially. Bills, investments, taxes, retirement accounts. He said it quickly, as if rehearsed, insisting that he only wanted to help make her life easier. Margaret listened quietly while Lauren folded her hands together and nodded. Daniel continued, saying that Lauren had always been better with finances, more organized, more detail-oriented. So he had already helped set something up. According to him, it would simply allow Lauren to manage Margaret's accounts, just to make sure everything ran smoothly. Margaret stared at the small bread plate in front of her, letting the words settle. The restaurant was warm, filled with the low sound of conversations and the clinking of glasses, but suddenly everything felt distant. She had managed her own money her entire life. Every paycheck, every savings account, every careful investment meant to carry her through retirement. Yet Daniel spoke as if those things were now responsibilities that belonged to someone else. Lauren smiled politely and explained that it would actually remove stress from Margaret's life. No more worrying about bank statements. No more confusion about online transfers or retirement distributions. Lauren said she would simply handle it all. Margaret nodded slowly, though she had never once asked anyone to take that responsibility away from her. The food arrived, and Daniel began talking about other things, about work and weekend plans, about a possible home renovation he and Lauren were considering. Margaret listened, smiling when it felt appropriate, but something small had shifted in the back of her mind. She noticed how easily the subject had moved past the decision that had just been made. She noticed how Daniel never once asked if she was comfortable with it. By the time dessert arrived, Lauren was already describing how she planned to reorganize Margaret's accounts to make everything more efficient. Margaret simply stirred the melting ice in her water glass and watched her son laugh at something Lauren said. In that moment, she realized the celebration dinner wasn't really about her retirement at all. It was the quiet beginning of something she had never expected. The moment her independence started slipping out of her hands, one polite conversation at a time. The first sign that something had truly changed appeared 2 weeks later when Margaret Whitmore stood at the checkout counter of a small grocery store near her home. She had done her shopping the same way for years, slowly walking the familiar aisles, choosing fresh vegetables, a carton of milk, and the brand of coffee she had always liked. Retirement had not changed those small routines. They were comforting, steady, predictable. When the cashier told her the total, Margaret reached into her purse and slid her bank card across the counter. The young cashier ran at once. Then again, the machine made a quiet error sound. The cashier looked up with an apologetic smile and said the card had been declined. Margaret felt a small wave of confusion pass through her. She had never had a card declined in her life. She asked the cashier to try again. The result was the same. Margaret stepped aside to let the next customer move forward while she opened her purse and checked the card carefully, as if the plastic itself might explain the problem. Eventually, she paid with a small amount of cash she happened to have with her, though it was barely enough to cover the groceries. The entire drive home, she kept replaying the moment in her mind. When she reached her house, she placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter and called Daniel. Her son answered on the second ring with his usual cheerful tone. Margaret explained what had happened at the store, expecting him to sound surprised. Instead, there was a short pause on the line before he said it was probably nothing to worry about. Daniel told her that Lauren had recently started reorganizing the accounts, and sometimes banks temporarily restricted cards during updates. He said Lauren was making sure everything was structured properly for retirement income and tax efficiency. Margaret listened quietly while he spoke. She could hear Lauren's voice faintly in the background asking who was on the phone. Daniel told her it was his mother and repeated Margaret's concern out loud. Lauren's reply carried clearly enough for Margaret to hear a few words. She said she would look into it later. The conversation ended quickly after that. Margaret stood in the quiet kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended. Later that evening, she attempted to log into her online banking account using the same password she had used for years. The screen refreshed once. Then a message appeared telling her the login information was no longer valid. Margaret tried again slowly, typing each letter with careful attention. The message appeared again. She sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. The house felt unusually silent. Outside, a car passed slowly along her street, and the faint hum of its engine faded into the distance. Margaret realized she could not remember the last time she had asked permission to access something that belonged to her. The next morning, Lauren called her with a calm and reassuring voice. She explained that she had changed several passwords and security settings so that everything could be organized under a new financial management system. Lauren said it would prevent mistakes and protect Margaret from unnecessary stress. She added that if Margaret ever needed money for something specific, she could simply call, and Lauren would transfer it immediately. Margaret thanked her politely and ended the call. After placing the phone back on the table, she sat very still in her chair. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, piece by piece, like the quiet clicking of puzzle parts fitting together. For the first time in decades, Margaret Whitmore could not access her own money without asking someone else first. The days that followed settled into a strange and uncomfortable rhythm that Margaret Whitmore had never experienced before in her own home. For more than 40 years, she had lived carefully and independently, always aware of every dollar that entered or left her accounts. Now she found herself waiting for someone else to decide when she could use money that had once been entirely under her control. The first time it happened felt small enough to ignore. Margaret needed to pay the quarterly property tax on her modest house in Dayton, something she had handled personally every year without delay. She called Daniel to ask how the payment should be made now that the accounts had been reorganized. Daniel sounded distracted when he answered, as if he were answering the call during a busy moment at work. He told her that Lauren would take care of it and that Margaret did not need to worry about those details anymore. Margaret thanked him politely, though the explanation felt strangely incomplete. 2 days passed, then 3. The payment had not been confirmed. Margaret checked the mailbox each afternoon the way she always did, hoping to see the usual receipt from the county office. Nothing arrived. Finally, she called Lauren directly. Lauren answered with the calm tone she always used, the same measured voice that carried quiet authority. She assured Margaret that the payment would be handled soon and reminded her that managing multiple accounts required time and coordination. Margaret thanked her again, though the words felt heavier this time. After the call ended, she walked slowly through the rooms of her house, the same small home where she had raised Daniel after her husband passed away. Every corner of the house held memories. The narrow hallway where Daniel used to leave his school backpack. The kitchen table where Margaret graded hundreds of essays late into the evening while Daniel studied. Nearby, she had built this life carefully, one responsible decision after another. Yet now the simplest financial tasks required approval from someone else. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began noticing other changes that were harder to ignore. Monthly bank statements no longer arrived in the mail. When she asked Daniel about it, he explained that Lauren had switched everything to electronic delivery to make the system more efficient. Margaret tried once again to log into the online account, hoping the access issue had been resolved, but the password reset process required a verification code sent to Lauren's phone number. Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the laptop. One afternoon, she decided to withdraw a small amount of cash from the bank branch downtown, thinking that speaking to a teller in person might solve the problem quickly. The young man behind the counter greeted her politely and asked for identification. He typed her name into the computer, then paused as his expression changed slightly. He explained that the account now had an authorized financial manager listed and that certain withdrawals required approval from that person. Margaret nodded slowly, thanking him for explaining. She walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sunlight, the spring air warm against her face. Cars moved steadily along the street, and people passed by carrying shopping bags, completely unaware of the quiet realization forming in Margaret's mind. For the first time since she had started working as a young teacher in her 20s, Margaret Whitmore understood that she had somehow become a guest in her own financial life, standing politely outside a door that used to belong entirely to her. Margaret Whitmore did not speak about the situation to anyone for several days, but silence did not mean she stopped thinking about it. In fact, the quiet only gave her more time to notice details she had previously ignored. Small things began to feel different. The mailbox that used to bring her monthly statements now carried only advertisements and catalogs. The email account she checked each morning contained newsletters and school updates from former colleagues, but nothing from her bank. It was as if the entire financial part of her life had quietly been moved somewhere else, somewhere she could not see. One afternoon, Margaret sat at the same kitchen table where she had spent decades grading papers for her students. The late afternoon sunlight fell across the surface of the table, highlighting the faint marks left by years of use. She placed her reading glasses on the table and stared at the blank space in front of her, letting her thoughts wander through memories that stretched back many years. When her husband Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack, Daniel had only been 17 years old. Margaret remembered standing in the hospital hallway that night, realizing that every responsibility now rested on her shoulders alone. She had worked 2 jobs during those early years, teaching during the day and tutoring students in the evenings. Every dollar she saved had a purpose: college tuition for Daniel, mortgage payments for the small house they lived in, emergency savings for whatever life might bring next. There had never been anyone else managing those decisions for her. She had made them carefully, step by step, for decades. That evening, she opened an old wooden drawer in the cabinet beside the kitchen sink. Inside were folders that had not been touched in years. Insurance papers, old tax returns, a small envelope containing the original documents from when she first purchased the house nearly 30 years earlier. Margaret slowly flipped through each page, remembering how proud she had felt signing those papers for the first time. She had not inherited wealth. She had built stability through patience and discipline. As the sun moved lower in the sky, a quiet realization began forming in her mind. Daniel had always been a kind boy growing up, but kindness and awareness were not always the same thing. He had trusted Lauren's confidence, her certainty about finances, her ability to speak in complicated terms that made everything sound professional and responsible. Margaret could see now how easily that confidence could convince someone that control was simply another word for help. Later that evening, Daniel called to check on her. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful, as he asked if everything was going well. Margaret told him that she was doing fine and that she had been spending time organizing old papers around the house. Daniel laughed softly and told her she should enjoy retirement instead of worrying about documents and records. Margaret agreed politely. After the call ended, she remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time, the old folders still spread out in front of her. Somewhere between the quiet pages and the fading sunlight, Margaret Whitmore reached a calm and unexpected conclusion. If someone else believed they were managing her life now, then the first step forward would be understanding exactly how that control had been created in the first place. Margaret Whitmore did not rush her next step. For most of her life, she had solved problems slowly and carefully, the same way she had guided generations of students through difficult lessons. Acting too quickly often meant missing something important. So she began with observation. The following week, she called Lauren and asked a simple question about the property tax payment that had been delayed earlier. Lauren responded with her usual calm confidence, explaining that several payments had been reorganized to align with a broader financial strategy. The explanation sounded professional, but Margaret noticed something in Lauren's tone that felt slightly different from before. There was a subtle assumption now, a quiet certainty that Margaret would accept whatever decision had already been made. After the call ended, Margaret returned to the folders she had taken from the kitchen cabinet. She spent most of the afternoon reading through old records and comparing dates, bank account numbers, investment statements, retirement distributions from the state pension system. Many of the documents were familiar, but some details had begun to look different when viewed through a new perspective. Margaret realized that most of the changes Daniel and Lauren described were never fully explained with written documentation sent to her directly. Instead, explanations arrived through brief conversations or quick phone calls. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Information had slowly shifted away from her hands. The next morning, Margaret drove across town to visit the local branch of the credit union where she had opened her first account many years earlier. The building looked almost exactly the same as she remembered, with the same brick exterior and the same small parking lot shaded by tall maple trees. Inside, the quiet hum of printers and low conversations filled the room. Margaret approached the reception desk and politely asked if she could speak with someone about her account records. After a short wait, a middle-aged banker named Thomas invited her into a small office. Margaret explained that she wanted to review the authorization documents connected to her financial accounts. Thomas typed quietly on his computer for several minutes, scrolling through several screens before printing a few forms. When he placed the papers on the desk, Margaret saw something she had never personally reviewed before. The document listed Lauren Whitmore as the primary authorized financial manager for several of Margaret's accounts. The authorization allowed Lauren to make transfers, reorganize investments, and manage daily transactions. Margaret studied the document carefully, noticing the date it had been signed. It was the same week as the retirement dinner. Thomas explained politely that the arrangement was not uncommon, especially for clients who wanted family members to assist with financial planning later in life. Margaret nodded as he spoke, though her mind had already moved to a different realization. She thanked Thomas for his time, collected the printed copies, and walked back out into the afternoon sunlight. The air was warm and quiet, and the slow movement of traffic along the street felt almost peaceful. Margaret sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. In her hands were the papers that explained how control had quietly changed direction. And for the first time since that dinner, Margaret Whitmore understood that before anything else could change, she needed to learn exactly how the system had been designed to keep her on the outside. Margaret Whitmore drove home slowly from the credit union, the printed authorization documents resting quietly on the passenger seat beside her. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the streets of Dayton, and for a moment everything outside the car looked perfectly ordinary. People were walking their dogs. A man watered his lawn. A school bus passed through an intersection carrying children home for the day. Yet inside Margaret's mind something had shifted into a calm and steady clarity. When she arrived at her house, she carried the papers inside and placed them carefully on the kitchen table. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down, reading each line again with patient attention. The language of the document was formal but clear. Lauren Whitmore had been granted financial management authority across several accounts connected to Margaret's retirement funds. The authorization allowed Lauren to transfer money, manage bill payments, and reorganize investments without needing Margaret present. Margaret noticed something else as she read more closely. The document itself had been signed electronically, and although her name appeared on the form, she could not remember sitting down to review the full agreement in detail. The date matched the week of the retirement dinner, the same evening Daniel had first mentioned simplifying financial responsibilities. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and replayed the memory carefully. The conversation at the restaurant had been brief. Daniel had spoken quickly, explaining that Lauren would help organize things so retirement would be easier. Margaret remembered nodding politely at the time, trusting that the arrangement would simply help with small administrative tasks. She had not imagined that the agreement would grant someone else complete operational control over the accounts she had built during 4 decades of work. Margaret opened her eyes again and continued studying the paperwork. The structure of the authorization itself was not illegal or unusual. Many families used similar arrangements when elderly parents needed assistance. But Margaret also understood something important about the difference between assistance and control. Assistance meant guidance while the original owner remained fully informed. Control meant decisions could be made quietly without the owner even seeing them. As the evening light faded through the kitchen window, Margaret gathered the documents into a neat stack and placed them inside a folder. She moved slowly through the house afterward, turning on the living room lamp and checking the lock on the front door, the same evening routine she had followed for years. Yet tonight her thoughts felt sharper than they had in weeks. Daniel and Lauren likely believed the arrangement was settled permanently. From their perspective, the system was already organized and running exactly the way they intended. Margaret, however, now possessed something she had not had before. She had the full picture. She understood when the authorization had been created, how it had been structured, and why the financial information had slowly stopped reaching her directly. That knowledge did not make her angry. Instead, it created a quiet determination. Margaret Whitmore had spent most of her adult life teaching young people how to analyze problems carefully before reaching conclusions. Now she applied the same discipline to her own situation. The documents on the table were not the end of the story. They were simply the first clear explanation of how the control had been built, and understanding that structure was the first step toward deciding what she would do next. The next morning, Margaret Whitmore woke earlier than usual, long before the sunlight reached the kitchen windows. For several minutes, she remained still in bed, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house around her. Retirement had changed many things in her daily routine, but waking early had never been something she could easily stop. Decades of teaching had trained her body to greet the day before most people even poured their first cup of coffee. She moved through the house slowly, starting the coffee maker and placing the folder of financial documents on the kitchen table again. The papers looked the same as they had the night before, yet the meaning behind them felt clearer now. Margaret knew that confronting Daniel or Lauren immediately would not help her understand the full situation. Emotional conversations often closed doors instead of opening them. Instead, she decided to observe quietly for a little longer. Later that afternoon, Daniel called to ask how she was doing. His voice sounded relaxed, the same casual tone he had used during most of their recent conversations. Margaret answered calmly and told him she had been organizing paperwork around the house and preparing for the slower pace of retirement. Daniel laughed lightly and said she deserved the rest after working so many years. Then he mentioned something that made Margaret pause. He said Lauren had been reviewing the investment accounts and might make a few adjustments soon to improve long-term returns. Margaret thanked him for the information and asked a simple question about the accounts themselves. Daniel responded with the same general explanation he had used before, describing how Lauren understood financial markets better than either of them and was making responsible decisions for the future. Margaret listened without interrupting. When the call ended, she sat quietly with the phone in her hand for a moment, thinking about the way Daniel had spoken with complete confidence about changes he did not personally manage. The next day, Margaret decided to take a short drive to the public library downtown, a place she had visited often during her teaching years. The building was quiet in the late morning, filled with the familiar scent of old books and polished wooden tables. She found a seat near a large window and opened her notebook. Margaret began writing down everything she knew about the financial arrangement so far. Dates, conversations, the authorization document she had received from the credit union. Slowly, a timeline began to form across the page. Each small event connected to the next. The retirement dinner, the password changes, the missing statements, the restricted withdrawals. When Margaret finished writing, she leaned back in her chair and studied the list carefully. For the first time, the entire situation looked less confusing and more like a structured system built piece by piece. Whoever created it had made sure information traveled in only one direction. Decisions moved forward quietly, while explanations moved backward slowly. Margaret closed the notebook and looked out the window at the quiet street beyond the library. She did not feel anger rising inside her. Instead, she felt the same calm focus she had often experienced while solving complex problems with her students. Margaret Whitmore now understood something important. If control had been built step by step, then reclaiming her independence would also begin with small and careful steps. Margaret Whitmore left the library that afternoon with the notebook tucked carefully inside her purse and a calm sense of direction forming in her mind. For weeks, she had felt as if the ground beneath her financial life had quietly shifted without warning. Now the situation looked different. It looked organized, deliberate, and most importantly, understandable. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because Margaret spent the entire trip thinking about the next logical step. When she arrived at the house, she prepared a light dinner and sat again at the familiar kitchen table where she had spent so many evenings during her teaching years. The folder of documents rested beside her notebook. Margaret opened both and reviewed them slowly, comparing the timeline she had written with the authorization forms from the credit union. One small detail stood out to her more clearly now. The authorization granted Lauren operational control, but it did not remove Margaret's legal ownership of the accounts themselves. Margaret closed the folder gently and leaned back in her chair. The distinction between control and ownership might seem small to someone unfamiliar with financial paperwork, but to Margaret it meant everything. It meant the structure Daniel and Lauren had built was not permanent unless she allowed it to remain that way. The following morning, Margaret made a quiet phone call to the credit union and asked to schedule another appointment with Thomas, the banker she had spoken with earlier. The meeting was set for later that week. Margaret did not mention the appointment to Daniel or Lauren. She continued her normal routine, watering the small plants near the front porch, checking the mailbox each afternoon, and taking short walks through the neighborhood just as she always had. On Thursday morning, she drove back to the credit union and met Thomas again in the same small office. Margaret explained calmly that she wanted to understand every option available to account owners who wished to modify financial authorization arrangements. Thomas listened carefully and began outlining the procedures. Some changes required simple written requests. Others required updated documentation and identity verification. Margaret asked questions patiently, writing notes in the same careful handwriting she had used during her teaching career. By the time the conversation ended, she understood something clearly. The system that had placed control in someone else's hands could also be adjusted by the person who legally owned the accounts. As Margaret stepped outside the building, the cool afternoon breeze moved gently through the tall maple trees in the parking lot. She paused beside her car and looked at the sky for a moment, feeling the quiet steadiness that had guided her through difficult moments many times before in life. Daniel and Lauren likely believed everything had already been settled weeks ago. From their perspective, the situation probably appeared stable and final. Margaret Whitmore knew something different now. Control had been arranged through documents and procedures, and those same documents and procedures could be revisited. The realization did not bring anger or urgency. Instead, it gave Margaret the same calm confidence she had always relied on when facing complicated decisions. She understood the structure of the system now, and that knowledge meant the next move would belong entirely to her. The following week, Margaret Whitmore returned to the credit union with the same calm focus she had carried since the day she first reviewed the authorization documents. The morning air was cool and clear as she walked into the building, greeting the receptionist politely before sitting down with Thomas once again. This time the conversation moved directly to action. Margaret explained that she wished to modify the current authorization structure connected to her retirement accounts. Thomas nodded with quiet professionalism and placed several forms on the desk. He explained that as the legal owner of the accounts, Margaret had the right to update or revoke financial management permissions at any time, as long as the proper identity verification and documentation were completed. Margaret read every page carefully before signing anything. Decades of managing her own life had taught her never to rush important decisions. After verifying her identification and completing the required paperwork, Thomas processed the request through the system. Within the hour, the financial authorization granting operational control to Lauren Whitmore was formally removed. The accounts were restored to Margaret's direct management, and new access credentials were issued exclusively to her. When the final confirmation printed from the office printer, Thomas handed the document across the desk with a polite smile. Margaret thanked him sincerely, placed the papers into her folder, and walked back outside into the quiet parking lot. The maple trees moved gently in the afternoon breeze as she paused beside her car, feeling a steady sense of balance returning to her life. She did not rush to call Daniel or Lauren immediately. Instead, she drove home and placed the updated documents inside the same kitchen cabinet where she had kept important records for years. That evening, Daniel called as he often did during the week. His tone sounded relaxed, and he asked whether she had enjoyed her afternoon walk through the neighborhood. Margaret answered calmly and told him she had spent the day taking care of a few personal errands. There was a brief pause before Daniel mentioned that Lauren had planned to review the investment accounts later that evening to make another adjustment. Margaret listened quietly before replying in the same steady voice she had used throughout the conversation. She explained that the accounts had already been reviewed earlier that day and that she had decided to resume managing them personally from now on. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of surprised silence. Daniel began asking questions, but Margaret answered gently and without anger. She explained that retirement had not taken away her ability to manage the life she had built through decades of careful work. The conversation ended politely, though it carried a new understanding neither of them had expressed directly. Later that night, Margaret sat alone on her back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the quiet street beyond her yard. The evening air was peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the same independence she had known for most of her adult life. Margaret Whitmore had not raised her voice or created a dramatic confrontation. Instead, she had simply learned the system, understood the structure behind it, and calmly stepped back into the role that had always belonged to her. In the quiet stillness of the night, she realized something simple but powerful. The life she had built through patience, discipline, and responsibility had never truly left her hands. It had only required the courage to reach out and take it back.